Okay, so you should have watched, if you were in my Art History 1 class, you should have watched all of the ancient Greek lectures at this point, and you should have last watched the one about the Etruscans. Okay, so today we are going to start talking about Rome. And this is not loading all the way and is slightly off center, which is weird. Let's see if the rest of it's going to work. There we go. Okay, so today we're going to start talking about art in the Roman Empire, and we're also going to talk a lot about architecture and architectural kind of technological developments that were really important. So to start us off, we all know more about Rome than we think we do, I think. So you know how I am. I like to start off asking you what you think you know about something before we really get into it. So what do you know about Rome? First of all, generally in my seated classes, a lot of people know what this building is, and you probably do too. This is the Colosseum, right? Pretty famous, pretty iconic, recognizable thing. If you didn't know that was the Colosseum, that's okay. We will talk about it eventually. This is another lecture that covers quite a lot of things and quite a lot of time, so it's going to be broken up into parts. So in this first one, we're really just going to talk about art and architecture and history related to the early Roman Republic and the very, very early empire. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what that means. So at this point, when I ask people what they know about Rome, there's a variety of answers. Some people say things like gladiators. We know about gladiators and gladiator fights in Rome. A lot of people mention the Colosseum. Some people mention that the Vatican is there, Vatican City, which is in fact its own city-state within Rome even today, which is kind of cool. And that's of course where the Pope lives, the head of the Catholic Church. Some people talk a little bit about other famous architectural things there. In class, yesterday, someone mentioned the Trevi Fountain. The Trevi Fountain is quite famous. If any of you have read the Dan Brown novels, you might know some things about Rome from those, from Angels and Demons and the Da Vinci Code. They both have some scenes that are there, particularly Angels and Demons. Not that I'm necessarily advocating Dan Brown as an art historical reference, but he does have a lot of art history woven into his novels, which is kind of fun. They're kind of good for, like, I consider them like airplane books, right? You know, kind of fun for airplanes. So let's start off talking a little bit about Rome and just kind of some of the mythos, the kind of iconic legend that is Rome, and why it's such an important part of art history. So the Roman Empire at its height in 117 is massive. The far-flung Roman Empire centers on the city on the Tiber River, which is of course Rome, and according to legend, Romulus, who we mentioned last time with the Etruscans, founded a modest village of huts on April 21st, 753 BC. 9 centuries later, Rome was the capital of the greatest empire the world had ever known. It's sometimes called the Imperial City. And this Imperial City of Rome awed foreign kings and even later Roman rulers who ruled from outside of Rome and came to visit and see it. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus reported that when the Emperor Constantius visited Rome in 357 CE and entered the Forum of Trajan, all this we'll talk about later on in some of the later lectures. So the Forum of Trajan had been constructed 250 years prior to this visit from Constantius, but he stopped in his tracks, astonished and marveled at the Forum's opulence and size, which cannot be described by words and could never again be attempted by mortal men. So Rome is another one of those places in the ancient world that was very impactful and really astonished people and was really magnificent. So we're going to talk a little bit about Rome and about its history. So I was looking for a map that showed the Roman Empire so you could get an idea of how large it is. And this map is a little bit silly looking, but so many of them are so complicated. I just wanted something that you could see really clearly. So you can see Italy, Italia there, which is of course where Rome is. But the empire spreads all the way out like this. And this is all of the Roman territories at, well, not all of them because you can't see the UK up there, but this is the Roman Empire when it was at its greatest extent, which it was in 117 AD. Okay, so a couple of things about Rome. Most of the major roads in Europe now, today, in 2021, still follow the Roman roads that were built. So they were very good at building roads, and the routes that they set into the landscape of Europe are still largely the paths that a lot of people travel today, which is kind of amazing. They invented concrete. We're going to talk about that a lot today. It's very important. So it leads to kind of an architectural revolution, which I'll talk about in a minute. They invented the modern calendar. That is another thing that someone in my class, seated class yesterday knew and mentioned, which is true. They invented a lot of the aspects of modern government. The Greeks, they kind of copied some of the stuff that the Greeks did and expanded on it a little further. And then we have Romulus and Remus. Romulus kills his brother Remus. They were raised by wolves, according to the legend. And he founds Rome in 753. Later, after this, much later, centuries after this founding, it becomes known as Caput Mundi, C-A-P-U-T-M-U-N-D-I. That means the head of the world. It becomes the sort of world-dominating force, and that's the Western world, though they do get down into, they get a little further east and into some other areas. So we're going to look at several different aspects of Rome, but before we get into all of that, I want to just familiarize you with some of Roman history. My impression in the last few years is that you don't learn a lot about Roman history when you study history in high school, just kind of a little bit. So I'm just going to give you kind of a crash course. So one of the things is we have the founding of Rome on Capitoline Hill. So Rome is sometimes called the Seven Hills, so it's built in this kind of hilly area. And Capitoline Hill was a place that was originally settled by the Etruscans, and there were some structures there that were made by them. In 509 BC, the Romans overthrow Tarquinius Superbus, who was the last Etruscan king, and here we have the rise of the Roman Republic. And we're just going to look at a little bit of this history. So basically, with the rise of the Roman Republic, first of all, what's the word republic? It's a little tricky in contemporary society as Americans for us to divorce the word republic, or say the Republican government, with what our contemporary political parties mean. That's not what I mean. A republic is a form of government that is run by officials elected by the people. Okay, so it's not a monarchy. You don't have a king like the Etruscans did before, and the different people who were living here before. So in the Roman Republic, they're run by a senate. And if we look at the word senate, it has the same root word as senior, and that is not an accident. They come from the same word because the senate was a council of elders. Okay, so it's kind of a ruling by this group. And we have a senate today, right? And these are people that we elect to make decisions on legislature for us. Similar sort of thing. This is a body of men who were making decisions for the rest of the people. In the Senate body, there's two elected consuls, C-O-N-S-U-L-S. That's sort of, kind of like a president, except not as much power. But they're sort of the equivalent of the executive office that we have today. And there's a special rule where if there's some kind of crisis, like war breaks out or something, and they need someone who can take command of the military and make decisions really quickly, they can make one of those consuls the dictator temporarily so that they have more efficient decision making to handle crises. That comes into play later. Okay, the other thing that you need to know about Roman society at this time, before we do our crash course, is it's a very class-oriented thing. So we have two major classes, and those are the patricians. Those are wealthy people who own land. And we have the plebeians, and those are like farmers, merchants, freed slaves, okay? And a lot of that has to do with not just how much money you have or that you own land, but your ancestry. So we'll talk about that when we get into the artwork in a little bit, but this is kind of how society is divided up, okay? So if you see someone call someone a plebe online or a plebeian, that word refers all the way back to ancient Roman history, where it was kind of considered a lower class than the patricians. All right, so very snobby, very problematic kind of thing going on here. Okay, so let's just do this quick run through of Roman history. Then we're going to, once we get to each stage of this through the artwork, we'll go into it a little bit more. Basically, we start with the monarchy from 753 to 509 BC, and this is when we have the rule of Latin and Etruscan kings. I don't mean Latin kings like the gang in LA. I mean kings who were part of non-Roman groups of people in Italy, in the area that is Rome today, prior to the establishment of the Republic. So we have all these city-states, kind of like in Greece, so not just one big country, lots of different cultures, different city-states. We looked at the Etruscans last time, and they're ruled by their own kings. The first kind of king of more than just one city, of a greater area, is the Etruscan king Tarquinius Superbus, okay? Then we have the Republic from 509 to 27 BC, and the Roman Republic lasts until the title of Augustus is bestowed upon Octavian after he defeats Mark Antony in a civil war. So you remember I just told you that the Senate has those two consuls, which is kind of like a weaker version of a president, and then they can temporarily make them a dictator in times of crisis. Well, with Octavian, they decide to give him a different title, Augustus. They don't really decide so much as he makes them, and that makes him the permanent dictator, basically. Okay, so in this time period, and this isn't everybody, these are people that are historically fairly significant. So we have Marcellus, who's consul, Marius consul, Sulla, who is important when we talk about Pompeii. I'll talk about him a little more, but he's the consul, and then he's briefly the dictator during crisis, and then he goes back to being consul. And we have Pompeii. We have Julius Caesar, who of course is very famous, has salads named after him. Most people have heard of him. So he's the consul, then he becomes the dictator. He stays the dictator, and people don't like it, so he's murdered by his closest allies, or the people he thought were his closest allies, which is quite a famous story. Shakespeare wrote a play about it. I'm sure that you're familiar. And then Mark Antony, who is very famous because he was married to Cleopatra, so we kind of know who he is. So he goes back to being the consul. He doesn't think there should be dictators, and then Octavian takes over and kind of changes everything. So then we get into the early empire from 27 BC to 96 CE, and this begins with Octavian Augustus and his Julio-Claudian successors. So like when we were talking about Egypt, we have a dynasty system, meaning that the title is passed on hereditarily, right? You have heirs. The thing that's a little different with the way the Romans do it is you don't necessarily have to be like the son of the emperor to then become the next emperor. They do strange things like adopt adult men that aren't actually related to them, or are just sort of like their nephew or something, or grandnephew or something like this, so that they can pass on their lineage to those people if they don't have an heir they want to pass it on to. So it's a little bit more complicated, but it's the same kind of thing. It's like keeping it in the family, but the definition of family is expanded a little bit. So first we have Augustus. I have some of the empresses listed parenthetically here because some of them were quite influential, particularly in the realm of art, so we're going to talk about them a little bit more later. So we have Augustus. Augustus's wife, Empress Livia, was very influential, and we'll talk about her when we talk about the four different styles of Roman painting. We have Tiberius. We have Caligula. He has a kind of famous porn named after him. Not that any of you necessarily know that, but just that is a thing that exists. We have Claudius, who's married to Agrippina, who's quite influential. We have Vespasian. We have Titus, who has the Shakespearean play. And we have Domitian. Okay. Then we get into the High Empire. The High Empire began with the rule of Nerva. And then we get into what are the guys that are known as the Spanish emperors. So they're men who were born not in Italy, but in Spain. But again, this is the Roman Empire is quite expansive, so places outside of Italy are part of Rome now. And those emperors are Trajan and Hadrian. They're both pretty important, and we'll talk about them quite a lot when we get to this. And then this ends with the last emperor of the Antonine dynasty. So we have Nerva, we have Trajan, Trajan and Platina. We have Hadrian and Sabina. We have Antonius Pius and Faustina. Marcus Aurelius, who's quite famous, with his wife Faustina the Younger. Marcius Versus, who was a co-emperor with Commodus, who is the guy who's the emperor in the Gladiator movie with Russell Crowe, which is quite old now, so I don't know if that's still a relevant connection. Okay, this is the last thing that we're going to go over in this overview, and then we'll get into the artwork. So the late empire begins with the Severan dynasty and included the so-called soldier emperors. So these are guys who weren't really part of one of these kind of royal dynasties, but they were great generals. They were great warriors. And so then they became emperors because, kind of like if you look at American history, General George Washington, he was a great general in our Revolutionary Wars, then people were like, make him the president. Similar sort of idea. They were heroes, and so they were trusted with the fate of the empire and became, the dictators became the emperors. Okay, and so that's in the 3rd century. And then we have the tetrarchs, which is where the empire gets divided into 4 pieces and 4 different people rule. And then we have Constantine, who's quite famous and is the first Christian emperor. So we have Septimius Severus, who's married to Juliana. We have Caracalla, who's married to Plautilla. We have Severus Alexander, Philip the Arabian, Trajan Decius, Trebonius Gallus, Diocletian, and then Constantine. Okay, and then the Roman Empire splits in half, and we have the Western Roman Empire, sometimes called the Holy Roman Empire, and we have the Eastern Roman Empire, which leads into Byzantium, and we talk about that in our unit on the Byzantine art. So that's what's coming. But whoa, let's back up and talk about art and architecture before we see what happens post breakup of the empire. But that's just kind of a crash course, so you can see structurally what's going on. Okay, so at this point, going all the way back to the Republic, when we get into the founding of Rome, we see that the Romans have conquered the Etruscans. They conquer who were there, right, in Italy, in what's now Rome. They conquer the Gauls, who were to the north. They conquer the Samnites and the Greek colonists, who were to the south. They conquer the Carthaginians, who were in North Africa and were led by Hannibal. Hannibal's quite a famous historical figure. And then in 211 BC, Marcellus conquers the Sicilian town of Syracuse. Okay, and when he conquers Syracuse, which is on the island of Sicily, it is a Greek colony, it ignites this craze for Greek art. People get super into Greek art, and that becomes kind of the style. They want everything to look like High Greek or Hellenistic art. Then, in 146 BC, as I talked about in the last of the ancient Greek lectures, Greece becomes a Roman province. So they take over all of Greece. So now they have these architects who know how to do this style incorporated into the Roman Empire, and their influence spreads more rapidly. In 133, Pergamon is willed to Rome by its last king, and so that has a lot of Etruscan heritage there, right? So we then have this kind of Roman style coming up that's kind of a combination of late kind of high classical and Hellenistic Greek influence and Etruscan influence, and sort of smushing them together and then being merged into this new kind of Roman style. Okay, so let's look at some art. So we'll start in the Republic of Rome. Okay, so this is the Temple of Fortuna Varela. It's originally called the Temple of Portunus. So this is a really interesting building, and having just watched the Etruscan lecture, you can probably recognize some aspects of this if you look at the floor plan. It looks like an Etruscan temple, right? So unlike the Greek temples, where we have columns all the way around and everything is very symmetrical and you can approach it and walk up the steps into any side and go into the temple, this is very much the Etruscan style, where you have a front porch area, which is called the pronaos, literally meaning before the naos, which is the central chamber. And that is the only way you can go in. That's the only place the steps are, so it's not really a stylobate with steps all the way around. That's the only place that has freestanding columns. The columns the rest of the way around are engaged columns, meaning they're attached to the wall. So that's kind of new. That wasn't really a thing that the Greeks were that into. We do see that these columns are of the Ionic order, which is of course one of our Greek orders, but the temple doesn't follow any of the rest of the rules of the Ionic order. So this is the kind of thing that the Greeks would not have liked very much, really. When we think back to the great Greek architects who were really into ratios and everything relating mathematically to each other and everything being this holistic thing that's very harmonious, the way the Romans take elements of the Greek style and sort of bastardize it and incorporate these other styles into it would have really irritated those people who developed these orders. Luckily, they're not here to see it, so it's okay. But basically, we have elements of Greek. We have the Ionic columns, we have a pediment, we have an entablature, though they don't quite follow the rules, the Ionic rules of those elements. And then we have the layout of an Etruscan temple. Okay, kind of put together. The stone that this is made out of is called tufa, Tufa, which is local to the area. It's kind of a little bit rough. It also has travertine. It's then overlaid with stucco and made to look like marble. So they would grind up marble into dust, mix it with the stucco, and do kind of a facing coat, like a faux finish, to make it look like it's marble, but it was much cheaper to construct it out of tufa and travertine. Okay, so, and this is named for Fortunus, who he's the Roman god of harbors, so port, the local god of ports where ships come in, and he becomes kind of affiliated with this idea of good fortune and success and prosperity, right? Because trade is such an important part of making money. So we have Fortunus. His name gets kind of twisted about, and we end up having Fortuna, which leads to fortune, which leads to that kind of idea of what we have today for fortune, for like good luck, and also you know, like good luck, like being fortunate, and also fortune, like prosperity. Okay, so let's look at another example. So this is the Temple of Vesta. We remember Vesta is, the Greek version of Vesta is Hestia. So this is the goddess of home and hearth. She's also a virgin goddess. So if you see in anything in pop culture a reference to Vestal virgins, those were young women who were devoted to the goddess, who were kind of, they're kind of like priestesses in training, Vestal virgins. So that's where that phrase comes from. She is very important in Roman culture, and she's also sort of affiliated with having like a successful home. Having, so you want to pray to Vesta when you're trying to build your home or when you're trying to start a family or something like this. So she's the goddess of hearth and home, and is pretty important. This is located in Tivoli. Tivoli is just east of Rome. If you look at this and you look at the plan when it was complete, this is a round temple. We saw these kind of become popular at the end of the high classical period in Greece and carry on through the Hellenistic period. Some of you wrote about some of these round temples, and the word for that is the same as the Greek word for the beehive temples, or the beehive tombs of Mycenae, and that word is tholos. Tholos. So again, we have this idea of a tholos, this kind of Greek idea that the Romans take, and they like the look of this, but they alter it slightly. So you can't walk into it on all sides, and they don't necessarily follow all the rules. If you look at the columns here, we have Corinthian columns. So that is that's that style that came in with Polyclitus the Younger in the Hellenistic period. So we see that kind of more fancy, more ornate kind of column become really popular, and the Romans really like Corinthian columns, so we see quite a few of them. We don't have steps all the way around like you would in a Greek tholos, and this is made out of concrete, which is fascinating to me. Thinking about things in the early 1st century BC being made out of concrete, concrete to me seems like such a contemporary thing, or at least modern to contemporary. So thinking about concrete being this old blows my mind every time I talk about it every semester. So I'm just kind of fascinated by it. So let's talk about it a little bit, okay? So concrete leads to what is called the Roman Architectural Revolution. And it makes lots of things possible structurally that were not previously possible. So here are some illustrations of some of those things, and I'm going to jump back and forth between this slide and that slide so that you can see the illustrations as I'm talking you through this. In my seated class or my online class, these are the kind of words that you want to know for things like quizzes, because I tend to ask you about them. So concrete, which in Latin is opus cementitium, is made out of lime mortar. That's not lime like the fruit, that's lime the mineral. So it's lime mortar, volcanic sand, water, and small stones. Small stones are called caminta. Caminta sounds a little bit like cement. That's the root of our contemporary word for cement. And this is based on an idea of hydraulic setting cement, meaning you need water for it to set. The volcanic ash that's included in there is what makes it really durable. The word for that was pozzolana, Pozzolana. And the binders included, which come in the lime mortar, are gypsum and the quicklime. Okay, so that helps it all kind of stick together. Tufa is added as aggregate sometimes, so those small stones are often tufa. And it has a high content of alumina and silica, okay, because it has sand in it, right? So that's concrete. That's really important. It's maybe the most important thing the Romans invent, and they invent lots of important things like aqueducts, like modern government, like the use of the arch, but concrete is super, super important. Okay, I talked about kind of the faux finish of the stucco mixed with marble dust to sort of make some of these things that are made out of cheaper materials look like they're made out of marble. They also use something called revetment. Revetment is just facing. Generally, it's like thin pieces of marble that are used to cover rough concrete. So they'd make the thing out of concrete and then face it in marble, which is something that we still do today, right? We have veneers on houses, veneers of stone or brick to make it look like it's made out of that, but it's really like wood underneath, something like that. So that's that. Then we have another really important invention. That's the barrel vault. This is also sometimes called a tunnel vault, and basically it's like if you take a simple arch. Arches are really important to Roman architecture and structural development. So you take an arch and then you just expand it in space and it makes a barrel vault, which creates a semi-cylindrical ceiling over parallel walls. Semi-cylindrical meaning half a cylinder. So this first illustration, which I realize my face kind of cuts off part of it there, but that's a barrel vault, okay? And the thicker sides on the edges, on the outside of those parallel walls, that's the buttressing, okay? So buttressing is lateral support below the vaults to counteract their outward thrust. So when we were talking about the prehistoric Aegean structural developments, we talked about the corbelled vault and how that development helped disperse some of the weight of those really heavy stones they made everything out of, right? It helped disperse the weight off to the sides so they could build higher. The arch does that more efficiently. So the arch displaces the weight of above so the ceiling won't collapse, and it kind of channels it down those sides. So then those sides have to be thickened or buttressed to help stand up and not collapse under the weight the arch is putting out through them and into the ground. So pretty smart design there. We'll talk about buttressing a lot when we get into the Romanesque architectural movement and later flying buttresses when we talk about the Gothic movement. So buttressing is a concept to think about it. Just think of it as like a support system on walls, a reinforcement on walls. But because of the concrete, we're building this much, much thinner than with those gargantuan huge stones that we saw in the Cyclopean masonry when we were looking at the prehistoric Aegean. Okay, the next super important invention structurally is the groin vault. This is also sometimes called a cross vault, and it's where you have a barrel vault and another barrel vault, and you intersect them at a perpendicular right angle. So this is the intersection at right angles of two barrel vaults of equal size, and it is structurally, it sort of supports itself better, so it requires less buttressing, so you can have thinner walls. So there's the groin vault. It's the second image there, which is a very smart design, very clever. Then we have the fenestrated sequence of groin vaults, which is not an individual word, but is a concept I want you to be aware of. If any of you took French in high school, what does the word fenestrate look like? Fenestra, right? Fenestra. Fenetra being the word for window, ouvre la fenêtre, open the window, fenetra. So fenestra, fenestrate, fenestrated means it has windows, okay? So if you have a sequence of groin vaults, because it requires less buttressing, you can leave openings in the archways, which create windows on the second story of a structure, which is pretty revolutionary because this is of course way pre-electricity. So if you have all these windows on the second story, a bunch more light can come into your structure, right? So we have open lateral vaults that form a clear story, which when we talk about cathedrals later, we'll talk about clear stories a lot, but basically just a series of windows on the second floor. So that's a pretty big deal. And that looks like this. So you can see our fenestrated sequence of groin vaults there, which is pretty cool. Oops, wrong way. Then we have the hemispherical dome. Okay, and so if a round arch expanded this way makes a barrel vault, a round arch that you spin all the way around makes a dome, right? And domes support themselves quite well. So a round arch rotated around the full circumference of a circle makes a dome, and the walls, the cylindrical wall that the dome is resting on is a drum. We call that a drum, okay? So there is the hemispherical dome, which is a very sound kind of structure. And then oculus, which is just the word for eye, is a circular opening at the apex of a dome. So it's kind of like a skylight, and you can see that there. Okay, so that's a lot of good terminology as we go forward and look at how the Romans were able to do all the amazing things that they did. So this structure is pretty amazing. This is the Sanctuary of Fortuna Primigenia. It's in Palestrina, Italy, and it's from the late 2nd century. And so Fortuna Primigenia is the goddess of good fortune. So she's related to the other guy we were talking about, the god of ports, Fortunus. So she's the goddess of good fortune. So this sanctuary is devoted to her and her followers and priestesses. It's terraced. If you look at the reconstruction down below, it kind of, to me, always makes me think of Hatshepsut when we were talking about the Egyptians and Hatshepsut's mortuary temple. So that was a terraced structure. So it's built into the hillside and then has all these different levels, right, that kind of have open air patios that you can walk on. The way this is able to be built up so high and so soundly is A, it's made out of concrete, and B, all these arched openings are barrel vaults. So the barrel vaults are holding up this structure. And what's kind of incredible about this thing, to me, is that it's still standing today, and they built this bigger, like, I don't know what it is, it's like almost looks like an apartment complex or something, on top of it, on top of the original structure from the late 2nd century, and it's still holding everything up. It's still structurally sound, which is pretty incredible when you think about that. So this is a really big deal in terms of structural engineering of the time. So this is revolutionary. Okay, we're going to talk about things other than architecture for a minute. So one thing that becomes very important and very popular at this time period, and again, we're in the Roman Republic leading into the early empire, is portrait art. Okay, so there are these things called imagines, which there's an example of them above. The original ones are all destroyed because they were made out of wax, but some of the molds they were made with exist. So we know exactly what they looked like, and there's lots of writing about them. So imagines were basically wax likenesses of ancestors. So they would do impressions of generally it was done when you died, of a death mask of an ancestor, and make these wax copies of their faces, of their likenesses, and then in your home you would have these wooden cabinets that would have all your wax faces of your ancestors in it. And then for certain important feast days and things, you would take them out and wear them around in like a procession, okay, to celebrate your ancestry. And this is one of the things that's really important to the patrician families. So I talked about the patrician families, the kind of wealthy people, and then the plebeian families. So having ancestors and having enough money to have had these things done, have had wax copies of their faces made, sort of reinforce the fact that you were patrician. Okay, so it's a big status symbol, and it becomes quite important to these patrician families of this time. So it's one of the things that separates the patricians from the plebeians. Okay, so we have Polybius, who's a Greek author who wrote the history of early Rome, and he talks about imagines quite a lot, and is why we know a lot about this. So one of the things that this does is it impacts the style of art. So you know when we were talking about Greek art, a lot of times it was this ideal, right? You had to follow these exact proportions to make everything idealized, everybody looked young and beautiful, and it's not till like the Hellenistic period that we start seeing some interest in showing some older people and some imperfect people, kind of just to show humanity and to show that this is the human condition and what that means and what that looks like. So in Republican Rome, there becomes an interest in verism, V-E-R-I-S-M, which is basically just realism. So this is the way that this is mostly manifest is in portraits of men of advanced age. First of all, if you're wealthy enough to live to an advanced age, that kind of shows your status. Second, it becomes such a status thing to have portraits of ancestors that having a portrait of yourself at an advanced age, as is kind of an ancestor in the making, basically, becomes an important cultural thing. So we have these veristic portraits becoming quite popular, whereas in the past, you'd show someone, if you were showing a figure, you'd want them to look young and virile and da-da-da-da. So we have these veristic portraits becoming popular. Here we have an example of a Roman man holding the portraits, the busts of two of his ancestors, just to kind of show his ancestry, right? So this becomes kind of a thing. One thing that is really interesting to me about this, so here's another example of a head of a Roman patrician, a Roman wealthy man, carved out of marble. So one of the things that's interesting to me is we have things like the portrait on the right. So this is a Roman general in Tivoli, and if you look closely at his face, it's veristic. He looks older, he has wrinkles, his hairline is receding slightly, so he looks like he's of a more advanced age. But then look at his body. He's like super cut and looks like he's in his 20s and works out all the time. So it's this really bizarre combination of things. So part of how we get there is in contrast to the Greek art. So Greek sculptors would never have done just the head of someone. That was super rare, super weird and unusual, because the body was a whole and the head is part of the body, and proportion and everything being harmonious was really important to the Greeks and to their aesthetics. The Romans aren't so into that. They're like, the head is enough. The head, the bust, which is like from the shoulders up, is enough to be a portrait of someone. We don't need to show their whole body. This is also more economical. It's also more efficient, right? So this interest in these imagines also translates over to marble sculpture, where we start seeing busts become a thing in the sculpture world instead of whole body sculptures. And now that the Roman idea that the head and the body don't have to be together in artwork, they can be separated, that leads to other ideas like what we have with this general, where we have a head that looks the age that he was at the time it was commissioned, probably. He wants the verism, he wants to be advanced in age and show how wise and wealthy he is and how long he's lived, but he also wants to be super fit and look like he did in his prime as a young warrior, basically. So we see this mismatch, and this becomes something that you see in sculpture. So if you see a sculpture with an old head and a young cut body, that is from this period in the Republican Rome, most likely. The other thing that I really like about this, just because I think it's kind of funny, is so you have his older head, you have his younger looking body, which he's revealing, but You still have his cuirass, Cuirass, cuirass. So cuirass is the, you know, in any movie with Roman soldiers, the kind of molded leather breastplate, the armor that they wear. So there's different embellishments on that show what your rank is in the military. So he has his, that's what's under his little drapery there, if you can kind of see it sitting next to him. So he wants that in the sculpture because he wants to show that he's a general, that he's really high status in the military, but he doesn't want it to cover up his hot bod. So he has it sitting next to him, wants it in the picture, but then he also wants to look like super buff. So it's just a really interesting, just Roman masculinity, particularly at this time, is fascinating to me. It's very, very odd. So there's that whole thing going on. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Julius Caesar. So he is the consul, right, on the Senate. So it's kind of like a weakened president. He becomes dictator, and then he kind of decides that he wants to stay as the dictator, okay? And so one of the things at this time is we have coin money. Money is in the form of coins. And up until this point, the decor on coins was not a figure, or it was maybe a god, like the face of a god or a depiction of a god. But there weren't just regular human mortal guys on money. That was not a thing. So one of the things that Caesar is very clever about, and we see this from some leaders in the past as well. If we look at Hatshepsut or Ramses II, who both commissioned lots and lots and lots of portraits of themselves to be put all over Egypt so that people would see their face a lot and associate that with prosperity, with stability. So it's kind of propaganda through art, right? So if you see this nice sculpture, it makes you think your leader is important and is doing a good job because you're in a society that's stable and wealthy enough to have sculptures. So Caesar thinks, well, how can I reach the most people with my likeness and get them to be on my side so I can stay as the dictator and stay in power? And so he says, well, we have the denarius, which is the typical money of the empire. So he's like, let's put my face on it, because that goes all over and everybody uses money. And when you use money, it means you have money, so you're doing well. So every time you use money, you'll see my face and think that you're doing well and associate it with Caesar, associate it with me, Julius Caesar, as part of your wealth. And so this is in 44 BC, and it's the first time a non-god is represented on a coin, and it's after he declares himself Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator Perpetuus, which is the dictator for life. And so he's trying to get in good favor, and he wants it to be known that this is not a god, that this is a mortal man, and that this is in fact him, and that he is wise and has earned his place. So you notice that he has wrinkles, he has a little bit of a receding hairline, and they make the coins of him, they increase that receding hairline and the depth of wrinkles as these are produced to be in keeping with the style of Verism at the time, but also to show that he is aging, that he is a man, that he is their ruler and exists in the world, okay? So it's kind of currying favor through this sort of propagandic idea of putting his face on money. And this kind of, we see, I mean, it's not a bad idea. We affiliate money with success and stability still. If you're a fan of rap music, you hear people talking about Benjamins, being all about the Benjamins. What does that refer to? It's the American $100 bill that has Benjamin Franklin on it. So there's a relationship between that figure and success, which is Julius Caesar's idea. So it's pretty clever guy. Okay, so let's talk about slavery, which is always an uncomfortable and sad topic because slavery is bad in any connotation, obviously. I don't think I really have to say that, but just to be crystal clear, slavery is bad, obviously. So at this time, there are 2 million slaves in Italy. That's a third of the population. So that's a third of the population of the Roman Empire in Italy is comprised of slaves. And slaves are from all different cultures. Any culture that they've taken over, they have brought back people as slaves who were not killed, mostly women and children. And if you are a slave, you don't have rights. Basically, you can't own property, you can't vote, you can't commission artwork, and you have to live with your owner. That person is in charge of you. So one of the things that is better about Roman slavery than about, say, American slavery in the pre-Civil War South in the United States is that Romans could grant freedom to their slaves, and that was fairly common practice, especially upon their death. So when it's like, when I die, my slaves will be freed. When you're a freed slave, you're a plebeian, so you've gone up a little bit in status. So then you're able to in theory, kind of gain footing in the world. But we have things like these ideas about ancestry and having imagines and having portraits and things to establish your rank, right? And so it makes it, this is just one of the things that makes it kind of difficult. So what becomes a somewhat common practice that I think is super interesting is things like this. So here we have Publius Gessius. He is the owner of these two slaves, and slaves were not given last names, by the way, they had single names. And he commissions this work, which is a portrait of him and these two slaves, okay? And so it has his name, Publius Gessius, and then it has Gessia Fausta and Gessius Primus, which are his two slaves, but he has given them his name, okay, Gessia. And so he's freeing them. He's going to free them. He has given them his name, and he has started them in this kind of status by portraying them in an artwork, being depicted alongside him like his family. And this is helping to kind of establish them as freed in the world with some kind of status. And he's doing that through artwork, which I think is super interesting. And again, we see this, this isn't a standalone thing. There are several things that exist that are examples like this, which is pretty neat. It's kind of an interesting use of artwork. Okay, we are now going to talk about Pompeii. Pompeii is one of the things that people usually know at least a little bit about. So if you know anything about Pompeii, you tend to know that there was a volcanic eruption that covered it, just wiped out the town, but that volcanic eruption also preserved a lot of things, including the bodies of the deceased, but also their homes and their artwork and artifacts. So it's a little bit of a time capsule, sort of like Thera. When we were looking at Thera, when we were talking about the prehistoric Aegean and the giant volcanic explosion there. So the volcano that destroyed Pompeii is called Vesuvius. I really like the word Vesuvius. This is a horrible tragedy and lots of people died, but just the name of the volcano I think is sort of lovely, which is neither here nor there. So it erupts on August 24th, 79 CE. Okay, so we're getting a little outside the parameters of the Republic, but we're gonna keep talking about this before we get into the early empire. So originally in Pompeii we had the Oscos lived there, and then the Samnites, and then there's a war, an ally war between groups that used to get along. Pompey loses, and then Sulla, who's the consul, one of the consuls in the Republic, comes in and takes over and founds a new Roman colony here. Okay, and when this eruption happens, so I've talked about Pliny the Elder quite a bit in our Greek lectures and things. He's one of the historians who is why we know a lot of the things that we know. So we've now caught up to him. So before he was writing about things that happened before his life, so we're now contemporaneous with Pliny the Elder. He wrote Natural History, which was kind of a history of the Romans and the Greeks. And basically it's just a very important record of Greek culture and then leading into Roman culture. So he dies here. He dies at Pompeii. So he tries to go in and save people when this eruption is happening, but he's overcome by fumes from the volcano. That's how most of the people died. They died from the toxic gases that were coming out of it, and were dead before the lava and everything hit. So he dies. Pliny the Younger, who's his nephew, is on a boat and sees this eruption and sees everything happening. And so he leaves a very detailed account of what happened. Okay, so we have a very detailed account of the eruption of Pompeii. Pompeii is a really interesting city. I've been there. I highly recommend visiting this area if you're able. It's really fantastic. It's kind of amazing. You can walk around in it, and it feels, a lot of where you walk around in Italy feels very historic, but something about Pompeii, just, it's, a lot of the original spaces are still so complete that it's really interesting. It's a very interesting experience. So I like this little map that I've inserted because it has a nice little directory. So one of the things that's common in Roman societies, and is true in Pompeii as well, is that they're centered around something called a forum. So forum is a word that's taken on different meanings during the years. Sometimes when we say we're going to have a forum, it means we're going to get people together to have a conversation about something. Sometimes a forum, when I was young, was you know, like a chat group online, basically. Like a forum would be an online place where you and a group of people would comment about a common interest or something. A forum can mean a coming together of people to discuss something. In Roman times, it was a physical space. So a forum was kind of like a town square. In this case, a town rectangle. Okay, so the forum in a city is generally at the intersection of the Cardo, which is the main street that goes north to south, and the Documenus, which is the east-west avenue, so literally kind of like a town square or a piazza. And in the forum in Pompeii is surrounded by two-story colonnades on three sides of the long, narrow piazza. It's pretty long and narrow. It's a little bit longer than a lot of the forums of this time. And then on one end we have the temple of Jupiter. So this is originally the temple of Jupiter, and then it's changed. We'll talk about it a little bit more in a minute, but so we have a lot of the main buildings around the civic forum as the main thing. We have these civic buildings where we have important government buildings. We have the basilica. The basilica is the administrative building, kind of like a town hall. We have this temple to Apollo. We have different mausoleums, different important things to the function of the city. So there you can see the map, then you can see the picture of what the ruins look like today, and then you can see a drawing of what they would have looked like at the time of the construction. Okay, so we're going to go down on the surface and look at this thing like you can look at it when you go and visit Pompeii, which you should all do. So it's built in 70 BC. The forum, as I said, is like the public square. It's the city center of the intersection of the Cardo and the Cumanus, which is also called the Decumanus. And it was built by the Samnites. They were inspired by the Hellenistic architecture in the 2nd century. So again, that Greek influence. They built the two-story colonnade on three sides of the forum, and at the north end we have the Temple of Jupiter. The Temple of Jupiter was an Etruscan plan with Corinthian columns, and it was made of tufa and covered in white stucco, and it was that kind of stucco that had the marble mixed in so that it looked like marble. It had the marble dust mixed in with it, and it faced the forum. Okay, so then when the let's see, so then we have the takeover of the Romans. So originally it's the Temple of Jupiter. Here's the plan for it. So you can see that kind of Etruscan style plan with some of the Greek stylistic influences. And then in 80 BC, when Pompeii becomes a Roman colony, that's when Sulla comes in and takes over. It's converted into what's called a Capitolium, which is a triple shrine. And in this case, it's to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. So the Greek version of that would be Zeus, Hera, and Athena, right? So instead of just being a temple to Jupiter, they kind of rebrand it and make it a triple shrine to these three gods. And it looked like that. Okay, I'm going to talk about this amphitheater, and then I think we will pause and talk about painting in a separate lecture. Okay, so One thing about the structure that I did want to point out on the plan is you see you have the naos. So you have the pronaos, which is the porch, then you have the naos, which is like the center area. And if you notice, when you look in there, you have those rows of columns. So you now have a naos with 2 aisles. Okay, so that's something that becomes significant later when we look at the way these structures evolve. Okay, so the amphitheater is funded by 2 town officials, Quintius Valgus and Marcus Borcinus. And it's the earliest amphitheater known. So we looked at theaters, Greek theaters, but they were just on one side. It was a semicircle. An amphitheater is literally a double theater, so it goes all the way around. And this is the earliest one we know of. There could have been some other ones, but it's thought that this is the earliest one. An amphitheater literally means double theater. Theatron in Greek means a obscene place, a place to go see something. And this amphitheater could seat 20,000 people, which is quite remarkable to me, thinking about something this old, built in 70 BC, seating that many people. Okay, so we have the cavea. That's what you call the stadium, the seating areas. The stadium seating is called the cavea, C-A-V-E-A. It's made out of concrete. It's set into this structure that has all these arches all the way around and barrel vaults that go under it to support it, and that's how it's able to stand. We also have the arena. So this is the original word, arena. We still use the word arena today. And the arena is the oval part at the bottom where the action would take place, the play or the fight or the whatever was happening. And it's the kind of the center stage, right? The central stage. And the arena is named for, it's literally the name of sand that was used to soak up the blood. So while a lot of our Greek theaters is a scene place and the orchestra pit at the bottom is, remember the root of the word is a place for dancing, which sounds really nice. The Roman version is a little more intense. So we have the place where you sit, the cavea, and then we have the place where blood is soaked up. So there were a lot of fights. There were a lot of really brutal fights to the death that people would come and watch for entertainment, and they'd have people fighting like wild animals and things and being killed. So very, very violent things happened in these amphitheaters at the time. Okay, so I think this painting is fascinating. This is a painting in Pompeii, and it is on the wall of a house. It's in Pompeii. The house is in Pompeii. This is a fresco on its wall, and it was made between 60 and 79 CE. And so this you can see is the depiction of the amphitheater, and you can see there are gladiators fighting in there, and there are people sitting in the sides. You can also see there's like little vendors set up outside. But then the other thing that you see happening is all these people are fighting each other. So this refers to a really specific event that happened, and it's the brawl that happened at the amphitheater between the Pompeians and their neighbors, the Nucerians, Nucerians. So they got into a big fight. And because they got in a fight, the amphitheater is closed. It's put out of commission for 10 years, for a whole decade, because this fight was so bad and so many people were killed. So it's kind of wild. You can also see something interesting up above, which is called a velarium, V-E-L-A-R-I-U-M, and that's a cloth awning that could be rolled down if it was too sunny or if it was rainy to cover the top, or it could be rolled back, which is kind of cool. None of these survive, obviously, we just have depictions of them. So it's kind of interesting. So I just think that this is a pretty cool document of this time. And that is going to lead us into talking about the structure of Roman houses and the 4 kinds of Roman painting. Maybe I'll go ahead at the end here and just talk about the structure of a typical Roman house at this time, and then we'll talk about painting in a separate lecture because this is getting kind of long. So one of the great things about Pompeii and Herculaneum, which is nearby, is we have these perfectly preserved houses with lots of artifacts and things. The word for house, for a Roman house, is a domus, D-O-M-U-S. The narrow foyer where you walk in was called the fossis, which is the word for jaws, which is kind of crazy, like that you call the entryway into your house the jaws. There was always a basin called an impluvium, which stored rainwater, which again, if you took French in high school, the word for rain is plou, il fait plou, means it's raining. So impluvian, Romance languages are based on Latin, so you can see connections to a lot of words. So you have this open area. The compluvium is the open part, kind of the skylight in the roof that would allow rainwater to collect in this basin, and that was a water source for your household. You also would have the cubicula, which are, the cubicula are bedrooms. Cubicula or cubiculum is a singular, cubiculum, which sounds sort of like our word cubicle. But instead of a cubicle, which is generally in an office, it's a bedroom, but a small room. The bedrooms were fairly small. Then you have the alae, which were the recessed areas in the back, kind of wings, so kind of recessed seating in the back. You have the tablinum, which is the home office, which tableau is a desk in French, so you see the connection between office and the desk in the words. You have the triclinia, which is the dining room. The peristyle was kind of a framed garden area. It was like an interior courtyard, basically. So this is kind of the typical layout of a Roman house. Look at a specific one in Pompeii. This is the House of the Veti. There are lots of pictures of this online. You can find all kinds. It's a little bit atypical of a layout in that it's a little more elaborate. It's a little bit fancier. Okay. It was owned by brothers, Aulus Vedius Restitutus and Aulus Vedius Conviva, and they were freed slaves. They were freed slaves that were able to move up in status and become merchants, and this is where they lived in this really fabulous house. We're going to look at this house, some specific rooms in this house in the next lecture when I talk about the 4 styles of Roman painting, because there's some really excellent, well-preserved paintings there. But here you can see the way the different aspects of the house are laid out. If you visit Pompeii, you can walk around this thing. It's pretty neat. Okay, so that is our first introduction to the Roman Empire and its art and architecture, and there will be a couple more of these. All right, thanks.